My son-in-law punched me in the face. My own daughter dragged me out by my hair. All because I said no to giving them $3 million. I sat on the curb, bleeding, shivering, and wondering when my child became someone I no longer recognized. But what they didn't know was that I had already prepared for this moment. And 1 hour later, everything began to fall apart for them. I moved in with my daughter April the week after I turned 71. Not because I couldn't live on my own, not because I needed help climbing stairs or remembering names, but because she said she missed me, said she wanted me closer, said her husband Russell even agreed. At the time, I thought it was love. I didn't realize it was strategy. Their house sat on a quiet street outside Des Moines, with a wide porch and a white swing that never got used. April had decorated the guest room in lilac and ivory, my favorite colors. There were new sheets on the bed. A framed photo of us from her high school graduation sat on the nightstand. I remember standing there, suitcase still in hand, and thinking, maybe this will be good. Maybe this will heal the distance between us. It wasn't like I had nowhere else to go. I had a small apartment 2 towns over. I used to work part-time at the public library, organizing the historical archives and leading genealogy workshops. That work meant something to me. So did the quiet of my own home, my little kitchen, my ceramic owl salt shakers. But April said she missed dinners with me, said she wanted her kids to hear my stories. I believed her. The first week went well. She made me tea each night before bed. Russell asked about my old job. The grandkids sat at my feet, while I told them how our ancestors came over from Wales. I felt almost foolish for having doubted her. Then, gradually, small things changed. April started bringing up bills more often. Her voice was light, but the words were weighted. She talked about refinancing, about college savings, about how tight things had gotten. Russell mentioned an opportunity through one of his clients. Some real estate fund. High return, low risk. He said it casually over dinner one night, while slicing roast chicken. I nodded politely, but something in my chest tightened. A few days later, April came into my room holding a folder. Inside were bank forms, a notarization page, and a printout of my investment account. She sat down beside me on the bed. Her tone was careful. She said they just needed a short-term transfer, said they'd return it within 6 months, said it would help secure their future and the kids. I asked her how she got access to my account information. She smiled, but her eyes didn't. She said she'd always known my passwords, said she needed to check in on me sometimes. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me. Something had cracked open. I thought about my late husband, how we'd saved for years, bit by bit, never touching the principal. I thought about the time I loaned April $2,000 to fix her transmission, and how she never paid it back. I realized I had moved into a house where love came with conditions. By the end of that second week, I stopped leaving my bedroom door unlocked at night. Looking back now, I wonder if any of you have ever felt that shift too. When a hug becomes a transaction, when kindness turns into currency. If you've ever trusted someone so much that you moved into their home only to feel the walls close in, then you know what I mean. And if you haven't yet, stay with me. Because what happened next would split everything wide open, and once that curtain got pulled back, there was no pretending anymore. Not for me, not for them, not for anyone. By the start of the third week, things shifted from subtle to obvious. I noticed it first with the grocery receipts. I always offered to pay for what I used: milk, bread, my special chamomile tea. But one afternoon, April left a receipt on the counter, circled items in red ink, and wrote a total beside it. Then she added a sticky note. Your share. Thanks. No greeting, no smiley face, just a number. Later that evening, she handed me a printed breakdown of the monthly utilities, highlighted, organized into columns. She pointed to my name at the bottom and said, with a calm voice, that fairness keeps things clear. That's how families stay strong. Russell didn't speak much that night, but he did nod in agreement while scrolling on his phone. I didn't argue. I walked upstairs with the paper in hand, sat on the edge of my bed, and stared at the math. The total wasn't outrageous, but the message was louder than the number. They didn't want a mother in their home. They wanted a tenant. A few days later, I found Russell in the kitchen flipping through a small black notebook. When I entered, he closed it too fast. He set it on the counter and smiled like nothing happened. Later that night, when they were out, I checked the drawer where I kept my personal folder. It was slightly out of place. The tabs had been shifted. Some of the documents weren't where I last left them. I didn't need proof to know. I had seen enough over the years to trust my instincts. Something was unfolding behind my back. The next morning, over breakfast, April casually brought up estate planning. She asked if I'd ever considered simplifying my accounts. Said she read that joint accounts were easier for emergencies. Then she mentioned her friend's mother, who had put everything in a trust for her kids, so there were no questions later on. I didn't respond. She kept talking. She said it wasn't about money. It was about clarity, about preparing for the future, about peace of mind. Russell added that he could help with paperwork if needed. He'd done it for clients. He had templates. He could make the process smooth. I looked down at my cereal. The milk had gone warm. The spoon felt heavy in my hand. That same afternoon, I called my financial advisor from my car. I didn't want to speak inside the house. I told him to set alerts on all transfers, block any changes, and flag activity from unknown IPs. He asked if everything was okay. I said it was a precaution, just in case. By the end of that week, April handed me a packet of documents. She said she had gone ahead and drafted a sample transfer of authority just to get the ball rolling. Her tone was casual, like she was offering me a cookie recipe. Her eyes, though, stayed fixed on mine a beat too long. I didn't open the packet. I set it aside and asked her how the kids were doing in school. She didn't push further. But 2 days later, Russell brought it up again, this time while we were alone in the garage. He said April was just trying to help, that I was lucky to have a daughter who cared so much. Then he said, with a smile too smooth, that money only creates drama when people get secretive. I stepped around him, walked back inside, and locked my bedroom door behind me. That night, I reviewed every single account I had. I changed passwords. I wrote down names of people I trusted. I scanned and saved backup copies to a flash drive I hid inside the lining of my suitcase. I didn't sleep much. I wasn't afraid yet. But I had begun to prepare. It wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. And this pattern had shown itself before. I just hadn't wanted to see it until now. The third week blurred into the fourth, and with it came an eerie shift in the house. It was in the way Russell's footsteps grew louder down the hall, in how April stopped knocking before entering my room, and in how the grandkids were suddenly too busy to spend time with me. Small isolations built slowly, then all at once. It began the morning I found my medicine organizer in the wrong drawer. I had placed it under my bed, like always. But that day, it sat on top of my dresser, open. The Tuesday slot was empty, even though I hadn't taken anything yet. I didn't panic. I didn't accuse. I just tossed the pills and started a new set from my travel stash. I began carrying my essentials in a zipped pouch that never left my side. I stopped leaving my coffee unattended. One afternoon, I overheard Russell in the backyard, talking too loud into his phone. He was pacing by the shed, his voice sharp. I couldn't catch every word, but I heard him mention equity, consolidation, and legal guardianship. Later that day, April asked if I would mind signing a few forms for her refinance. She said it was just a routine update. I asked her why my name was listed as co-owner of the secondary mortgage. She paused, just long enough. Then she said it must have been a clerical error. I knew then I had underestimated just how far they were willing to go. That night, I pulled out the manila envelope I kept hidden under the liner of my suitcase. Inside were old records from my husband's accounts, notarized copies of my trust, and a full list of my assets. Everything had been kept separate since he passed. That was always our plan. Russell and April didn't know that my name had never been attached to the Iowa house. They assumed I had nothing but the condo and retirement account. But the truth was, I still had access to a diversified portfolio, some of it offshore. I wasn't rich, but I wasn't dependent. The next day, I visited the bank, quietly. I asked to speak to manager-level staff. I presented my identification and initiated a full review of recent access attempts on all accounts tied to my Social Security number. There had been 2 failed login attempts from an IP address tied to Russell's business. I asked the manager to set the highest security level. Biometric access, in-person-only changes, and voice-verified transactions. She didn't ask questions. She just nodded and got it done. I returned home before sunset. Dinner was already on the table. April served roast pork with overcooked carrots. Russell asked how my day had been. I said I went to the park. He nodded, satisfied. That night, I barely slept. Not from fear, but from a growing sense that something inevitable was about to crack. And it did. 3 days later, I woke to find my room ransacked. My suitcase was unzipped, my drawers pulled open, even the lining in my coat was torn. My flash drive was gone. I stood silently in the doorway, heart pounding. Then I walked downstairs. April was in the kitchen. She didn't look up. Russell was by the fridge, arms crossed. I asked if anyone had been in my room. April said maybe one of the kids went in looking for scissors. Russell said maybe I had misplaced something. They said it too quickly. I didn't respond. I went back upstairs, closed the door, and picked up the landline I had hidden behind the bookshelf. It was a burner line I kept for emergencies, something my husband and I had used years ago when dealing with a real estate scam. I dialed a number I hadn't called in a long time. My lawyer's office. His assistant answered. I gave her the code word. She transferred me immediately. Within minutes, my attorney confirmed he could lock down everything. I asked him to trigger the fail-safe in my trust, to remove any shared power of attorney privileges, to notify my offshore custodian that fraud had been attempted. I also asked him to make a preemptive report to Adult Protective Services, just to put something on record. I wasn't accusing yet, but I wanted a trace. Then I packed a small overnight bag, only essentials. I didn't run. I didn't cry. I simply acted. That evening, as I came down the stairs, I saw Russell standing by the fireplace, holding my flash drive. He didn't say anything. He looked smug. April stood behind him, her face hard to read. I told them I was going out for a walk. They didn't stop me. At the corner of the block, I got into a black sedan waiting for me. My attorney had sent a driver. We drove straight to a safe location I had arranged years ago. A small house in Ames, deeded in the name of an old college friend who owed me a favor. The next day, I froze all joint assets, placed a fraud alert, transferred everything into a protected, irrevocable trust. And for the first time in weeks, I slept. Not deeply, but without looking over my shoulder. The silence in the safe house was different. It didn't echo like the big house. It wrapped around me like a warm coat. For the first time in weeks, I could hear my own breath again. I sat at the kitchen table that evening with a cup of peppermint tea, looking at the stack of documents my lawyer had sent over. Every page had a clear purpose. Every signature I made that night pulled a little piece of my life back into my hands. Over the next 3 days, I stayed in that quiet little house in Ames, with the curtains drawn and the phones silenced. I didn't watch the news. I didn't scroll through anything. I just thought. I thought about how it got this far. How two people I had once held as newborns, Russell and April, could turn so calculating, so cold. On the 4th morning, I received an email from the bank. There had been an attempted login using outdated credentials. Then another from my lawyer. He had spoken to the trust administrator. All assets had been moved. The new structure was untouchable, irrevocable. And the successor trustees I had named long ago, 2 women from my reading group, both retired professors, were now legally in charge if anything ever happened to me. That same afternoon, I requested a call with the lead investigator at Adult Protective Services. They had already opened a quiet inquiry, just as a precaution. I gave them everything. Every incident, every document, every photo I had discreetly taken of the drawer after it was rifled through. I gave them a timeline, down to the hour, of when I began noticing the manipulation. I wasn't pressing charges, not yet. But I wanted a record. The officer I spoke with was patient and precise. She didn't offer false comfort, but she did say something I hadn't heard in a long time. She said I had done the right thing. She said I wasn't alone. Later that evening, I drove back to the city. I didn't go to their house. I went to my friend Patrice's home. She greeted me with open arms, no questions, no judgment, just a hot casserole and a clean guest room. While I was there, I finally allowed myself to feel the weight. The betrayal wasn't just about money. It was about erasure. They hadn't tried to steal my accounts. They had tried to erase my autonomy, replace my legacy with their convenience. But they failed. And that truth held me steady when the letter came. It was a printed notice from a law firm representing Russell and April. The tone was sterile. They expressed concern over my sudden disappearance and requested a voluntary meeting to discuss a revised estate structure. They claimed I might be under undue influence, that others might be coercing me to cut them out. They referenced my age, my recent confusion. I handed the letter to my lawyer. He smiled as he read it, then made a copy, highlighted every loaded phrase, and drafted a reply that was firm but polite. He included proof of my legal capacity, recent cognitive evaluations I had done during a routine physical, and outlined the timeline of events I had already documented. Then he copied Adult Protective Services and the Federal Oversight Board into the response. The next day, a detective from the Financial Crimes Unit contacted me. The bank had flagged the earlier login attempts as part of a wider pattern of elder exploitations they were now investigating. Russell's name had come up before. April's, too. I sat across the table from the detective 2 days later. I told him everything. Not just the logistics, but the emotional sabotage. The way April would drop passive remarks about my health. The way Russell used silence to manipulate my responses. How they both slowly chipped away at my independence, dressed up as concern. The detective nodded, took notes, and asked if I'd be willing to testify if necessary. I said yes. But more than anything, I asked for protection for the future, for other women like me. In the following week, I met with my attorney again to draft a formal affidavit. It would be held in confidence unless the investigation moved to formal charges. But it was clear now, I hadn't overreacted. I hadn't imagined things, I had seen it, and I had responded. The final action I took that week was symbolic. I changed the name of the charitable fund I had created years ago with my late husband. Originally named after our anniversary date, I now called it the Eleanor Trust, after my grandmother, the strongest woman I ever knew. I restructured it so that every year, a portion of its interest would be granted to women over 65 who had survived financial abuse from within their families. I didn't need revenge, I needed meaning. And with that change, I felt something shift inside me, a kind of release. The anger didn't vanish, but it stopped burning. By the end of the month, I had officially relocated. Patrice helped me find a 2-bedroom condo in a quiet neighborhood with wide sidewalks and tall oaks. I unpacked slowly, placed photos of my husband on the shelves, framed a print of the trust certificate with my grandmother's name at the top. I made tea that evening, stood at the window, and watched the wind move through the trees. I had lost a family, yes, but I had also reclaimed something I didn't know I was missing: myself. Understood. I will now begin writing Chapter 5 directly into this conversation window, following all of your formatting and stylistic guidelines. The chapter will be approximately 980 words in American English, with a consistent, emotionally resonant narrative tone. Please give me a few moments to write it for you. 2 weeks passed. I kept to myself, living quietly in the condo Patrice helped me find. No social media, no phone calls unless necessary. The days were still and healing. I began walking again each morning, just before sunrise, with no music in my ears. Just the sound of gravel underfoot and the birds waking up. Then came the letter from the probate court. It had been sent to my old address, but redirected by my lawyer. Inside was a petition filed by April and Russell, requesting a formal hearing to declare me unfit to manage my estate. They were invoking the Elder Concern Act, claiming I was mentally compromised and being isolated by outside parties for financial gain. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so cruel. Attached were signed affidavits from 2 of their friends, people I had met no more than once or twice. They spoke of my confusion, of my supposed forgetfulness, and of an incident at a family barbecue where I allegedly asked the same question 3 times. It was laughable, but it was filed in court, and that meant it was now public record. I met with my attorney again. He didn't flinch. He had expected this. He laid out a plan, clean and calm, just like he always did. We would respond with documentation. My evaluations from Dr. Kirsch, my cognitive assessments, and sworn statements from my financial advisor, 2 neighbors, and 3 members of the church committee I had served on for 6 years. These people had known me far longer and more intimately than Russell or April's planted witnesses. But there was something else, something unexpected. The detective I had met with weeks ago reached out again. They had uncovered surveillance footage, bank cameras, not mine. 2 separate attempts by Russell to access accounts tied to my name, each time using documents that had been flagged as altered. That alone wouldn't result in charges, but paired with the pattern, it built a case. They were preparing to bring it to the district attorney. That same evening, I sat down with Patrice. I told her everything. I hadn't shared all the details before. She listened, didn't interrupt, and then offered me something I hadn't considered. She suggested I write a letter to the court myself, not just a legal response, but a personal one. She said, "Speak as a woman, not a client. Let the judge hear your voice before they ever see your face." It took me a day to decide. Then I sat down, pen in hand, and wrote longhand first. 4 pages. Not just facts, but feelings. I wrote about my childhood, about raising April, about her curiosity, her laughter, I wrote about the moment I realized she had changed. I described the silence between us that grew louder over the years, and I explained in simple terms that protecting myself was not cruelty, it was clarity, and it had come far too late. My attorney typed it up for the court. It was added to the response packet, along with supporting documents. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Those 3 weeks passed with a strange stillness. Not calm, but suspended. I didn't hear from April or Russell. Not a word. But the local papers picked up rumors of the probate filing. It was a small city after all. People whispered, old friends called, most just left voicemails. I didn't return them. Not yet. On the morning of the hearing, I wore a navy suit I hadn't touched since my husband's funeral. I brushed my hair smooth and pinned it back. I carried no bag, only a folder with my name on it and a heart that had learned not to shake. Courtrooms are colder than they look. I sat beside my attorney. Russell and April were on the other side. April wouldn't look at me. Russell did, just once, and then turned away. The judge entered. The hearing began. Their attorney spoke first. He painted me as disconnected, volatile, prey to manipulation. He used words like isolated, withdrawn, emotionally unstable. Then he introduced their witnesses, the same 2 people from before. They spoke in vague terms, heard from someone else, saw something once. Then came our turn. My attorney introduced the evaluations, the statements, the timeline. He walked through the pattern of control and coercion, then placed the letter I wrote on the record. The judge read it silently at the bench. When she looked up, she said only this, that it was rare in her courtroom to see such clarity from someone being accused of incapacity. The judge dismissed the petition without delay. She called the filing not just unfounded, but an abuse of process. She referred the matter for further review. We walked out without a word to Russell or April. There was nothing left to say. Back home, I made tea and sat on the balcony for the first time. The sky was wide, pale gold. The air smelled like rain. Later that evening, I received an email from a small women's advocacy group. Someone at the court had passed along my letter. They asked if I would speak at an upcoming forum. Not about the legal case, but about resilience, about reclaiming identity, about surviving quiet betrayals. I closed the laptop. Not ready yet. But the thought stayed with me, because maybe healing didn't look like closure. Maybe it looked like this. A quiet place, a name restored, and a voice that had finally found its volume again. The week after the hearing, something inside me shifted. It wasn't relief. Not exactly. It was something quieter, more hollow, like standing in a house that had been emptied out. The echoes weren't loud, but they were everywhere. I had won, yes, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like walking away from a battlefield alone, carrying only the silence of what was lost. That weekend, I stayed in. Patrice dropped by with groceries and a few tulips. I didn't say much, and she didn't press. She just sat beside me while I watered the plants and cleaned out the kitchen drawers. It was the first time I truly noticed how still my hands had become. No tremble, no tightness, just a slow steadiness, like something was finally settling. That night, I sat at the little table by the window and opened the storage box I had carried with me from the old house. Inside were photos, journals, and the leather folder that held all the old letters Russell had sent me in college, his childish penmanship, his little jokes, the promises he used to make to take care of me when I got old. I stared at one letter for a long time, then quietly set it aside. I pulled out my own journal. Not the one for lists or passwords, but the one with no lines, the one I hadn't written in since the year after my husband passed. I turned to a fresh page and wrote one line. I am still here. I wasn't sure what I meant exactly, but the words felt real, grounded. 3 days later, I met with my lawyer again. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to talk through the next steps, not legal steps, personal ones. He brought up the trust, the Eleanor Fund, and how the first round of grants could be released within 6 months. He mentioned that the applications were already coming in, women of all ages with stories of loss, of survival, of quiet reinvention. Then he looked at me and asked if I wanted to remain anonymous. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about what it meant to be visible, to have your name attached to something that others might one day cling to in their darkest hour, to stand up, not in spite of what happened, but because of it. I told him no. I wanted my name on it. That evening, I took a walk around the neighborhood. I passed a park with benches painted in pale blue and children running in circles. I sat for a moment, letting the late light hit my face, and I thought about April, not with anger, not even disappointment, just stillness. She had made her choice, Russell too, and now I had made mine. But this time, it wasn't reactive. It wasn't about protecting what I had. It was about choosing what I wanted to become. Back home, I made tea, then opened a blank document on my laptop. For the first time in years, I started writing my story. Not as a case, not as an article, but as a life. A full, flawed, quiet life. Mine. It began with the line I had written in my journal. I am still here. And from there, the words came like water. 3 weeks after choosing to go public with my name on the Eleanor Fund, a letter arrived from the office of a federal investigator. It was addressed to me directly, not through my lawyer, not through any legal channel. Hand-signed, tidy font, no red tape, just a quiet sentence at the bottom. They were reopening the inquiry into Russell. My fingers didn't tremble when I set the letter down. I didn't feel fear, just a tightness in my chest that told me the past wasn't finished with me yet. The next day, I met with the investigator. He looked far too young to be holding such power, but his eyes were patient. He explained that several suspicious financial transfers had been flagged in the broader investigation into elder exploitation in our county, and 2 names kept recurring, Russell and April. I listened. I gave them what I had. But more importantly, I gave them what no one else could. The story behind the numbers. Not a rant, not a list of grievances, just facts. Calm and sharp as glass. How April had slowly gained access to my digital accounts. How Russell had pushed me to sign over power of attorney without giving me time to think. How I had once believed this was normal, even loving. The investigator leaned forward. He told me they had subpoenaed the bank for voice recordings tied to wire transfers. In one of them, a man identified himself as my son-in-law, using my full name and social security number. The problem was, the voice wasn't mine. And the permission, it had never been recorded. The wheels of justice were turning now, and I was no longer the only one seeing the gears grind. That night, I sat alone in the living room with every light off, just the hum of the refrigerator in the next room. I didn't cry, I didn't shake, but I felt it, that low hum of reckoning. It didn't taste like vengeance, it tasted like gravity. 2 days later, Patrice stopped by. She brought a binder, thick with reports and recommendations from the board we had quietly assembled for the Eleanor Fund. They wanted to expand. More applicants, more outreach. A partnership with a university program that trained women in digital literacy and finance. I looked through the proposal and paused at a paragraph buried near the end. A speaker series, women over 60, sharing real stories of rebuilding, quiet battles and silent triumphs. They had penciled me in. I didn't say yes, I didn't say no. That night, I sat on the balcony again. The air was thick with early summer heat. A siren passed 2 streets over. I didn't flinch. I thought about what it meant to speak. Not whisper, not journal. Speak. And not just for myself, but for the hundreds of other women I had read about in the fund's early applications. Stories filled with disbelief, gaslighting, financial erasure, betrayal dressed up as care. My story wasn't rare. That was the hardest part. It was common, silent, ordinary. That silence needed to break. So I agreed. I stood up for the first of the small gatherings 2 weeks later. A modest community space in the basement of the local library. Folding chairs, coffee in paper cups, no microphones. I told them the truth. Not everything. Just enough. I told them I was 69, that I had raised a daughter I loved with everything in me, that I had watched her walk away, not in one loud moment, but in 100 quiet choices. I told them about Russell, and the bathroom floor, and the silence that followed. But mostly I told them about waking up, about the day I realized survival was not the end goal, that dignity mattered more than peace, that no inheritance, no bloodline, no shared last name could ever outrank the voice inside a woman when she finally said enough. There were no cheers, no applause, just silence and a few tears. But that silence felt different now, not the silence of shame, the silence of recognition. Afterward, a woman named Eloise took my hand. She was 73. Her daughter had taken her home equity line and vanished. She hadn't told anyone. Until that night. As she spoke, her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. And I realized that this was the true legacy, not the fund, not the courtroom victory, not even the name I had cleared. It was the simple fact that somewhere in that room, a woman had breathed a little easier because I had spoken first. By late summer, the name Eleanor Fund had started to circle quietly through non-profit spaces and retirement communities. Nothing flashy, just quiet momentum. I never intended it to become big, but sometimes, when you plant something honest, it grows. I had agreed to speak again, this time at a women's centre in Greenville, about 40 minutes from my place. They had printed little flyers, just my name, a time, and a title I hadn't chosen, Speaking Through Silence. The title sat heavy in my chest the whole drive there. The room was warm when I arrived. Fluorescent lights, coffee already brewing. I sat in the back while the organizers checked the seating. I didn't wear anything special, just a blue knit top, cotton slacks, and the silver watch Russell had given me in 1984. Funny how I still wore it. Not for the sentiment, just because it told time well. When it was time to speak, I didn't rehearse. I simply stepped forward and told the truth again. A different shade of it. This time, I spoke more about what came after. About what it felt like to sit in your own home again without waiting for footsteps to come up behind you. About learning how to cook for one and not feel pitied. About paying your own bills and feeling grateful for the quiet click of confirmation. I saw a few women nod. One reached for her purse to dab her eyes. Afterward, a woman with salt and pepper hair asked if she could walk me to my car. Her name was Judy. 71. Her story unfolded slowly, but I recognized the rhythm. A daughter who took over her finances. A son-in-law who handled the paperwork. And suddenly she couldn't access her own checking account. She whispered that she had no one else to tell. So I gave her the number, not mine, the center's, and told her to call in the morning. They had volunteers trained for exactly this. She held the paper like it was a lifeline. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not from nerves, from something else. It was the weight of it all. The stories piling up like fallen leaves, each one rustling with the same ache. There was no end to them. And for the first time, I wondered if I was strong enough to keep holding space for them. The next morning, I made oatmeal and stared out the kitchen window. The air was still, too still. I could feel something shifting again, but I couldn't name it. 2 days later, my lawyer called. The federal investigation had moved forward. Charges were being finalized. There were multiple counts: identity theft, elder abuse, financial coercion. Russell's name was listed. So was April's. The news didn't shock me, but it still stung. The part that caught me off guard was the press request. A journalist from a respected outlet had been following the fund's development. They wanted to feature the Eleanor Fund in a national story about financial abuse against seniors. They asked if I would go on record. Fully. I said I needed a day. I walked, for hours, through streets I hadn't seen in years, past the post office, the old community theatre, a bakery that now sold vegan muffins and lavender tea. The world had changed so much, and I had spent years just trying to survive inside of it. But now, I was standing in it, and maybe it was time to stop hiding. So I agreed. The article came out a week later. My name. My face. A photo of me standing in front of the library after one of the talks, sunlight catching the edge of my hair. The headline was simple. She spoke up. There were no angry calls from April, no letters from Russell, just silence. But not the kind that haunted. This silence felt earned. The following week, something unexpected happened. A young woman from a local university reached out. She was studying non-profit leadership and wanted to intern with the Eleanor Fund. She said her grandmother had been one of the first women to apply and had cried reading the acceptance letter. She said she wanted to help other women feel that seen. I told her yes. Not just because we needed help, but because I saw something in her. A continuity. Proof that what we were building wasn't about me. It was bigger. That afternoon, as I filed grant paperwork and updated budgets, I realized something. I hadn't thought about Russell or April in hours. Not from fear, not from pain, just hadn't thought of them. They had finally stopped living in my head, and that, more than any court decision or headline, felt like the real beginning. The day the letter arrived, I had just come back from the hardware store with a new light bulb and a bottle of vinegar. I saw the envelope sitting on the porch table, out of place, cream-coloured and thick. No return address, just my name, written in sharp, deliberate handwriting. I knew that script. It was April's. My fingers didn't tremble. I just opened it. Inside was a single page. It wasn't long, a few sentences at most. She said she'd heard about the Eleanor Fund, that she'd seen my picture on the article, and that Russell had told her they had made mistakes. That now he wanted to make peace, that they would like to meet for dinner. Just a quiet evening. Just to talk. She had included a location, a restaurant in a part of town I hadn't been to in years, not far from the courthouse, actually. The timing was casual. Friday. 7. I placed the letter down and went to boil water. I didn't need time to decide. I wasn't going. But I didn't tear it up either. I let it sit for 2 full days, untouched, next to the kitchen clock. I suppose I wanted to understand why I wasn't angry anymore, why the invitation didn't sting, why the silence inside me felt so firm. By Friday afternoon, I had forgotten the letter completely. It wasn't until the sun began to fall, and I saw the light outside shift to that strange gold hue, that I remembered. 7 o'clock. And then, at 7:30, my phone rang. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again and again. Finally, I picked up. It was a nurse from the emergency room. April had been admitted with chest pains, mild but enough to trigger a workup. They had found her number listed as next of kin. She had written my name. I sat on the edge of the bed, phone pressed to my ear. I could hear voices in the background, machines beeping. And for a moment, the air around me seemed to shrink. I asked the nurse if she was stable. She said yes. Then paused. Said April had asked for me. Said she was alone. I didn't answer right away. I looked down at my hands, at the veins, the skin, the marks of time that never used to be there. I thought of the woman who had dragged me by the hair, who had slammed the front door in my face, who had made me feel invisible in my own home. And then I thought of the little girl who once fell asleep on my chest every Sunday afternoon after church, who cried when she lost her stuffed elephant, who used to braid my hair with her tiny fingers and whisper that I smelled like lavender and paper. So I went. Not because I forgave her, but because something in me needed to see her as she was now. The room was quiet when I entered. She looked smaller than I remembered, her hair tied back loosely, an IV dripping slowly beside her. She opened her eyes and blinked. For a moment, I saw no recognition, and then her mouth moved. She said my name. I didn't speak. I just pulled the chair closer and sat down. The nurse nodded and closed the door behind me. We sat in silence for a while. Then April said she had read everything, the articles, the statements, the interviews. She said she hadn't realized how far she had gone, that she hadn't known what she had become, that Russell was the one who kept pushing, that she just wanted to protect what they had built. I listened. I didn't respond. Then she asked something unexpected. She asked if I had meant for the Eleanor Fund to be a message to her. I shook my head. I told her it was never about revenge. It was about reclaiming breath. Her eyes welled up, but she didn't cry. She said she couldn't undo what she had done, but she wanted to start again, not as mother and daughter, not as anything labelled, just two people who once shared something true. I stood up then, not abruptly, just slow, measured. I told her I didn't hate her, but I also told her I didn't belong to her anymore, that my peace didn't depend on her remorse. And then I walked out. Outside, the sky had turned navy. The hospital parking lot buzzed with motion. I exhaled. Not relief. Something deeper. I had just looked into the eyes of the woman who once broke me, and she no longer held any power. That night, I made soup, not because I was hungry, but because I wanted to taste something warm and quiet. I lit a candle, not for prayer, just for the calm flicker. And for the first time in years, I slept through the night without waking once. The morning after my visit to the hospital, I brewed a stronger cup of coffee than usual, the kind that clings to your throat a little longer. I stood by the window, watching the postman pass by like clockwork, his bag swinging with familiar rhythm. But that day, he didn't stop at my mailbox. He crossed the lawn, handed me an envelope directly. It was from the office of the United States Attorney. I closed the door and sat down before opening it. My fingers moved with steady purpose, but inside my heart was bracing, not with fear, with readiness. The letter confirmed what I had quietly hoped for. Federal charges were being brought against Russell. Fraud, coercion, financial abuse of an elder. It listed dates, filings, testimonies. And my name appeared more than once, not as a victim, but as a key witness. There had been an anonymous tip submitted to the IRS 3 months earlier. The audit had revealed enough to initiate a broader investigation. Apparently, I was not the only one Russell had tried to manipulate. The truth was unraveling. But here's the part I didn't expect. The anonymous tip had come from April, the same woman who had looked at me with hollow eyes just days earlier, the same woman who had dragged me out by my hair. I read the page again, slowly. The truth sank in with the weight of wet wool. She had turned him in, quietly. Before the dinner invitation, before the hospital visit. She had done it alone. I didn't know if it was guilt or fear or something else entirely. Maybe it didn't matter. What mattered was that she had cracked open the very house she had helped build. I placed the letter down and looked at the stack of seed catalogues by the window. Spring was near. The soil was thawing. I thought of the tomatoes I might try again this year. A week later, a federal officer showed up at my door. He wore plain clothes, but the badge in his wallet was real. He said my testimony would help expedite the case. Said Russell had already been approached for questioning, that his tone had shifted the moment he realized April had cooperated. There was no arrest yet, but I could see the arc of consequence beginning to curve. When the officer left, I sat in silence for nearly an hour. I didn't call anyone, didn't text. I simply walked around the house slowly, touching the old furniture, the wooden edges of door frames, the kitchen drawer that stuck a little when it rained. These were the pieces that held me, the ones they never touched, the parts they never stole. That night, I sat in the living room and turned on the television. Not to watch anything, but to hear voices. I had forgotten what it was like to be surrounded by noise that didn't cut. Then I reached for the journal I had been keeping in a small drawer under the coffee table, the one I started the week after I left their house. I flipped to a blank page and began writing. Not about them, but about me. About the parts of me I had found again. My spine, my silence. My pulse in the early hours when I walked barefoot through the hallway and felt no fear. About the slow unfurling of dignity after being buried for years under the weight of someone else's version of family. I didn't need justice to look like sirens and handcuffs. I just needed them to know I had survived, and that I had done it without their permission. When the phone rang later that evening, I let it go to voicemail. It was April. Her voice was low. She said Russell had left the house, that federal agents had come earlier that day, that he had packed a suitcase and slammed the door without looking back. She said she didn't know where he went. Then she said she was sorry, again. But it didn't sound like an apology this time. It sounded like release. I didn't return the call. Instead, I stood up, walked outside and breathed in the air. Cold, but clean. I wrapped my shawl tighter and listened to the leaves whisper. No one screamed, no one banged doors, no one stood behind me. For the first time in a long while, I was exactly where I wanted to be. And in the quiet hum of a world still turning, I smiled, not from triumph, but from peace earned. 3 days after I let April's call go to voicemail, a letter arrived from my attorney. I almost didn't open it right away. My mornings had become sacred again. I took my coffee slower, let the sun roll across the wooden floors without rushing it. But something about the envelope tugged at me. It was thick. I opened it with careful fingers. Inside was a copy of a legal document that made me sit down. Apparently, months ago, before the confrontation, before the dinner, before the bruises, I had signed a document I didn't remember. It had something to do with consolidating assets into a trust. I remembered Russell talking fast, printing things off his computer. I thought I had reviewed them. But this one had never come through me, and now it was showing up under my name. The trust transferred nearly $3 million from my brokerage account to a holding entity under Russell's name. The transfer hadn't completed because of an alert placed by the bank following a flagged request, one that came in while I was at the hospital. The letter continued. My lawyer had taken it upon himself to cross-check the records, and in doing so, discovered something else entirely. April's name had been added to the trust, but only conditionally. It would activate on my official declaration of incapacity. I held the paper in my hands and felt the chill settle through me. My own daughter had sat down at a table and signed documents, assuming I would one day lose the ability to speak for myself. She had built a future based on my absence, and Russell had guided the pen. But that wasn't the worst part. The lawyer's letter ended with a single handwritten sentence. He said he had a hunch, so he'd run my medical file, legally, against the timing of the trust preparation. The dates lined up with my fall. The fall I had assumed was an accident, the bruise on my neck, the dizziness, the medication I never remembered taking. It wasn't hard to connect the dots. They had tried to incapacitate me. Quietly, slowly, legally. They had anticipated resistance, but not survival. And now, that entire paper trail sat in a manila folder in the attorney's office, under lock and key, with a time-stamped log that made it legally impossible to argue ignorance. I walked outside after reading the letter. The wind was sharper than usual. I didn't mind. I needed it. I needed something real to press against my skin. I sat on the back steps and pulled the sleeves of my sweater down over my hands. I thought about all the meals I had cooked in that kitchen for April when she was young. I thought about the quiet years after her father died. How we had survived with just enough. How I had gone back to work at the local college's admissions office just to keep things moving. She never knew what I gave up. That was the point. She was never supposed to. But now, the woman she had become had not only turned her back on me, she had waited for me to disappear. She had signed her name to it. And Russell? He had planned the entire thing, like a chess match, cold, detached, believing I would never notice the checkmate coming. He had underestimated the one thing that mattered. I had lived through worse. The chapter of my life that included April and Russell was coming to a close. But not with a scream, not with courtroom drama. Just a woman on her back porch, holding her coffee tighter, her pulse steadier, and her dignity completely intact. Because survival isn't loud. It's quiet, and powerful, and absolute. It was a Thursday morning when I walked into the courthouse, alone. No makeup, no jewelry, no rush. The documents had already been filed. My attorney had handled everything. But I came anyway, to feel it, to stand on the cold marble and watch a chapter of my life seal itself shut. The court clerk looked up, recognized my name, and nodded quietly. The annulment of the trust was approved in chambers. The frozen funds were returned. The invalid power of attorney was nullified. And my name, my full, legal, untarnished name, was reinstated as the sole authority on my life. It didn't come with applause. No one cheered. But something deep inside me exhaled for the first time in months. Outside, I sat on the bench across from the courthouse steps. The sun felt warmer than it had in weeks. I had brought a small flask of tea. I sipped it slowly, feeling the warmth spread through me, calming, steady. A woman passed by, older than me, with a small dog in a stroller. We locked eyes just briefly. I gave her a soft nod. And for a split second, it felt like she knew, not the whole story, just the weight of surviving something and still standing. When I got home, I didn't go straight inside. I walked the side of the house and stood at the old potting bench. My hands itched to be in the soil, to press something living back into the earth. That afternoon, I planted 3 trays of pansies, purple and white. Hardy little things. They don't look like much at first, but they last through frost. They come back even after the cold tries to wipe them out. A week later, Russell called. I let it ring. He left a voicemail. His voice was lower than usual, said he was sorry, said April wanted to talk, said they had made mistakes. I deleted it. A few days after that, an envelope arrived. No return address, just my name. Inside was a photo. April, younger, holding her daughter, smiling. The edges were worn. I held it for a moment. I didn't cry, but I didn't throw it away either. I placed it in the drawer of my desk, the one I don't open often, the one where I keep the things that matter but no longer define me. I'm not angry anymore. Not exactly. There's a silence now, a different kind of quiet. Not absence, more like clarity, like a room that has finally been cleaned of echoes that no longer belong. And I've found something in that silence. Peace, not the kind that comes from justice, but the kind that comes from knowing I chose myself, that I reclaimed my breath, my voice, my place. I no longer live in reaction to what they did. I live in response to who I've become. If this story reminded you of someone who once tried to silence your worth, I hope you know it is never too late to take your voice back. Have you ever walked away from someone you loved to protect the part of you they kept trying to erase? Your story matters too. Share it below if you'd like, or just know you're not alone.